Hello, everyone. My name is Gretchen Rowe, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this episode of the Demme Learning Show. We're going to have a wonderful conversation today with my friend Patti Reed, talking about having difficult conversations with your teenagers. And I only wish Patti had been around when my teenagers were teenagers. I don't have those anymore. Actually, I have one, but he's an old soul and he's a very grown-up young man. And now I'd like Patti to introduce herself. Patti?
Hello, Gretchen, and thank you so much for having me this morning. It was great meeting you last year. We'll talk about that later. But I'm Patti Reed, and I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I am a leadership coach. And I've done lots of different things over the years. And like I said, we'll hear more about that later. But I am just so glad to be here with Gretchen today to talk to moms. I was a homeschool mom myself. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. And I have to say that when I met Patti last summer at the Great Homeschool Convention in Round Rock, Texas, I immediately fell in love with her because the message that she brings is a great deal of clarity and just resonates with so many of us who are in the homeschooling journey. And if you don't have teenagers, but you have children, someday you will have teenagers. And so I think you'll find an enormous amount of benefit in what Patti has to share with us today. Patti, do you mind telling us some of these conversations that we're going to have today come from your book? So do you mind sharing the title of that book with us?
Yeah, it is face to face, smart conversations with yourself, your teenager, and your young adult.
Absolutely. And I will tell you that I loved the book. I learned so much from it. And then I passed it on to a friend. And I actually wanted to get the book back from her so that I could have it here as a reference today. And she loved it so much that she passed it on to the youth pastor at their church. So
Mm.
right now it's in his hands, not in mine. So we're going to have to go with my perhaps not as terrific memory as it used to be, but we're get through this no matter what. Patti, tell us a little bit about how you came to be a coach.
Yeah. Um, Gosh, so just a little bit off the bat, I am married to Frank for 32 years, and I have two children that have given me lots of lessons, and there's lots of things in the book about them, and they gave me permission. And so, gosh, I came to be a coach. Really, I am a coach at heart. And I homeschooled my children when they were younger through probably about the eighth grade or so. But I also had a business. So I had an advertising business for 18 years where I, coached people in sales and things like that. And then after that, I built a business with Rodan and Fields. It's a skincare company. Actually, I still have that for 10 years and built a team. So I've always been leading for quite some time. And then in 2017, my daughter had just left for her adventure in life. And the Lord pretty much tapped me on the shoulder and said, I'd like you to start writing. And I thought, you have the wrong person because I don't write. However, we had a little bit of a wrestling match and he won. So, anyway, so that's really how the book came about. And like I said, I've always been a coach at heart, and I've just really put my experience, my lessons, and I am trained in something called conversational intelligence, which is basically based on neuroscience. And it is a body of work, Gretchen, that helps you understand what conversations open up the brain for trust and what conversations close them down. So when I wrote the book, obviously I'm thinking about all that as I'm applying questions and concepts and things like that throughout the 30 devotionals.
Sure, absolutely. So I have my notes here from going
Yeah,
through the book the first time, and I wondered if we could talk about some of those things.
sure.
One of the things that impressed me the most was the difference between agreements and expectations. And my goodness, that is a huge, we could spend the next hour just unpacking that in and of itself. But I wonder
Mhm.
if you could talk a little bit about why there's a difference between those.
Yeah, well, I think that actually, if I could kind of rephrase that a little bit, and then there are unspoken expectations a lot of times, right? So, as parents, we have expectations of our kids, but we've never really told them, maybe, or well, they should know. I mean, I raised them in my home and da 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 da. And so things aren't really out there on the table and they don't know. So I just think it's important to, especially as they get older. I wrote the book really for older teens and young adults because when they start to get older, you are letting out the leash. I mean, you have to let them make some decisions, and, when they're 13, I'm kind of still telling them what to do. But, when they get into those older years, you have to start practicing, they have to start practicing decision making. And so, what I like to say is, come to the table to have agreements. Matter of fact, I had a conversation the other day. I met this nice young man at the coffee shop. He's 23 years old. And he is studying to be a doctor. And we had this conversation about expectations and agreements. And he was like, oh, his parents more kind of like, this is what you're doing. And
Mhm.
so he loved the agreement idea. And because, they're adult, they're becoming adults and they need to learn these skills. So agreements, coming to the table and talking things out, work usually better than I expect you to, blah, blah, blah.
Right. Absolutely. And sometimes in the talking through of an agreement, you find your own erroneous thinking. And I
Mhm.
think that that's really important because clarity is so key, particularly as our children become adults and they make decisions that don't necessarily line up with how we thought we parented
Yes,
them.
yes, yes, yes. And if I could also say, Gretchen, that what you're also doing is you're giving them a voice. Okay. And both my children have a voice, sometimes maybe too much, but they have a voice. They are going to share what they think respectfully and their opinions and things like that. And that is so important because we need to help them develop their voice in this world.
Right. Well, my husband and I laughingly say that we gave birth to 6 firstborn children,
Oh
and
gosh.
all of our children definitely have a voice and an opinion.
Yeah.
And most of the time, those opinions are well counseled. And but you know what? Being able to create relationship is the most important thing. And when kids become young adults, that becomes tough. So you talked about another thing in your book that I just loved, and that was vulnerabilities. And I
Hmm.
want you said to be, let me see if I can quote this. You said it's all about being better, not bitter. And I love that. And I think it's really important. Um, that invulnerable model that we somehow erroneously believe we have to present in front of our children. Can
Mhm.
you talk about why that is a hindrance to good communication and relationship?
It's a hindrance to the relationship and the bonding. And just a little sidebar. So I grew up with English parents and very stoic and yeah, not a lot of emotions. And so emotions are real and they're healthy, and God made us with emotions. And so vulnerability, what I have found with my two children, and I think I mentioned before, my daughter's 24 and my son is 29, is the more I can, when those opportunities present themselves to have a humble moment or to be vulnerable with your feelings and your thoughts, I tend to go for it because I've been building this trust with my children for, obviously quite some time now, but it was through blood, sweat, and tears. It wasn't like it just arrived up because I have this training and I'm, going along in life and like to read and learn a lot of things. I actually have an example where I have a email that I send out every week, and just last week, the email was about a situation that occurred with my daughter. And when I launched my book, my husband's in radio. And so when we launched the book, I had a book launch party. And so I had, like, I don't know, 30, 40 people there. And so he interviewed me live and we were on Facebook Live. Well, he asked me about something and I shared something that I should not have because I did not clear it with my daughter. And she was watching. And morning it was, we need to talk. And I was like, oh gosh, I put my foot in my mouth again. What did I do? Anyway, she's a amazing, gracious person. And she said, this is what happened. And we didn't discuss this. You did not, you did not ask me for my permission. I mean, it's her story too.
Right.
So it's important that I asked, in the book, I asked them for their permission. So anyway, so I talk about what I didn't do. I did not defend myself. I did not argue with them. I did not, but with them. I gave her my full attention on FaceTime. I made sure she got all of her words out. And at the end, I just said, I am so sorry. Will you please forgive me? Because, of course, I never want to hurt you. And thank you so much for being brave to come to me and share that. And my daughter is the kind of person where, like, she's like, you're forgiven. She's just like that. And so, we're able to go on. But it was a good lesson and a good check for me as I go out and speak to people, right? So anyway, so the ability of like, okay, I'm not wrecking this. I love my daughter. She lives in New York City, so she's far away as it is.
Sure.
But it's the humility when we choose that and put our ego aside. It's the bond, it's the glue.
Absolutely. I said something a couple of weeks ago. I'm a high school swim coach, and I was having a conversation with somebody at some awful early hour at the pool. And I said something about keeping accounts short because no one is promised tomorrow. And I think um, how vitally important that is, particularly even more so
Yes.
as our children become adults.
Yes. Yes, and we're laying that foundation now as they're home, right? They're still in the nest, there's still lessons to be learned, and to start practicing things. Because I always say, Gretchen, when they leave, they don't have to come back. They don't have to call us. It doesn't matter if you homeschool them or whatever you poured into them. We as parents have to continue to adjust. We are, like I say to my husband, you're the adult in the room. Right? I mean, we're
Sure.
like further down the road, and we get to model to them what emotionally healthy relationships look like. So I always say, put on your big girl prayers and move forward to adjust.
Right. Right. And, okay, so you have an English background. Your parents were English. My father was German.
Mm,
That stoicism, that I don't want to use the word inflexibility, but it's definitely there as far as there is one there is
yes.
one right way to do something. Generationally, it's up to us to look at how we were parented and then improve that with our children. You mentioned something in the book that I thought was really terrific, and it was about coerced commitment. And
Mm,
that phrase has followed me around since I read the book last September,
yeah.
because I think I find myself, did I coerce a commitment out of someone, or did they assent willingly? And have I been coerced into a commitment that I didn't want? And those kinds of things. So I would really like you to talk a little bit about that and how we can recognize that in ourselves, because perhaps we
Mm.
don't recognize it when we're doing it to our children.
Yeah, and it's like I'm trying to remember, where did I write that? Where did
Well,
I
in
write that? But
context, you were talking about Exodus 14:14. And
oh,
we were talking, and what I said to you laughingly back in September was, I tell my kids you don't have to attend every fight you're invited to. But there
mhm.
is something about thinking through how what battles we choose, what principles we choose to stand on regardless, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah, and that is important. And I do remember that specific verse in my parenting journey because I know that the Lord gave that to me on with both of my children. And so, when I think about that coerced commitment, the first thing that honestly comes to mind is manipulation. And it might not seem like that at the time, but ultimately, we want our kids to do what we want them to do. And we want them to go on the path that we think is best and make decisions that, we made that maybe led to good things, But I think that they know and they sense and they feel when that is in play, and that is not going that's going to push them away. And I think by asking them, questions like, what is it that you want? Like, this gentleman that I think I mentioned earlier that I met at the coffee shop, and his parents really didn't ask him, what is it that you want? Like, what are your passions? If you had all the money in the world and all the resources, what would you do? It was, you're going to be a doctor because your sisters are doctors and you're going to be a doctor. Now, obviously, the kid's probably brilliant. You know what I'm saying? Like, because it takes a certain amount of intelligence to be a doctor.
Sure.
But there was no asking him. It was just, I think it was a cultural thing. They were from Nigeria, and I don't know their backstory and all of that. So the coerced commitment is, I think you kind of know if you're trying to push them to do something or be something that you want to be so that you can look good. I
Yep.
mean, let's face it, we kind of put our stock in our kids at times, and we really have to get over, look, you've done your best. You have poured into them for 18 years. And honestly, if I could be honest, because God reminds me of this often, we don't know what's best for them. So relinquishing control and that, manipulation, um, is probably a good idea.
I wondered if the last thing that we should talk about before we turn our attention to the wonderful questions we were asked today is
Mhm.
maybe we should talk about the circle of responsibility versus the circle of concern. I
Mhm.
loved the way that you put this in the book, and I would love for you to explicate that for the parents who are listening to us today, because I think that's something that maybe we don't think about as often as perhaps we should.
Yeah, and I love that concept, and I learned that concept from Paul David Tripp. He's written many books, and has just amazing things to say. And if could I read a little section of the book? Would you mind? Because I found that because I know that you were interested, in hearing about that. So what kinds of questions can we ask ourselves when it comes to our teenagers, our young adults, our kids? How will we know whether it is our responsibility or theirs regarding a particular matter? Is it within my circle of responsibility or my circle of concern? And so here's a few questions that you can take with you to consider as you determine whether you are to step in or step back. So the first one is, what are your main concerns around the topic? What feelings does it evoke in you? What does the Bible say about the topic? The problem may be easily solved by sitting with these questions for an extended period of time. I would also consider these questions. What role do I play or should I play in solving the plot problem? You might not need to. How am I to respond? And I would add, or not respond. Is God asking me to act upon the situation or trust Him to intervene? So those are just, some of the things that you can think through, because I am a true believer that they, you know, we can't be there to catch them all the time, especially as they get into their teen and young adult years. Because I can tell you this, that the brain learns best through failure. We don't like it. We don't want them to fail, and we don't want them to go through pain. There's no pain like kid pain. But I can tell you this, that my kids, especially my son, well, I have yeah, my son will, oh, you're really right about that, mom. That was really right. Like, he's come back several times and said, things like that. So we've got to let them go through hard, and we've got to let them figure it out. Now, we can be there as the coach, ask them lots of questions so that they can, you develop that executive functioning skill in the front part of their brain, and by asking good questions that will help them later. Oh, I'm going to process it like this.
Right. I think I mentioned this when we talked in our planning session that one of the things that I have learned to do with my own children is when they say, "Hey, I'd like your opinion on so and so." sometimes I'll ask for clarification on that. Do you
Yes.
really want my opinion? Or are
Yes.
you looking for me to be a cheerleader here in this moment?
Yeah.
And
That's good.
because it
That's good.
sometimes they're not really seeking my opinion, although they think they are, and they think that that's what they want.
Yeah.
And, this is a journey. I think one of the things that you impressed on me when we had our planning conversation was this isn't something that springs forth overnight. This is by journeying along together with them over time.
Mhm. And again, it's making that adjustment, Gretchen. That's what I talked about. There's so many books out there for, newborns and toddlers and tweens and teens. And what I noticed when I started to look and research, there's not a lot of information out there as they get into those older years. Like, now what? How do I, deal with them? How do I parent them? It's another adjustment for us. And if you can make the adjustment, you will be better off for it and better off in your relationship. And they want respect. They want to be like, we're adults. We're not 13 anymore.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
so
And I think
important.
that makes a difference.
It does.
We never stop parenting, but there is a point at which our parenting style and um,
Yes.
uh, hue and fiber needs to change
Yes. Yes.
so that that relationship can mature.
Yes. Yes. And flourish for
Yes.
sure.
We had so many wonderful questions, and I'm glad that you and I had the time to go through them a little bit. So,
Yeah.
we might as well start with something tough. My son is 16. How do you get teens to open up about their true feelings? That's a tough one.
Just, jump right in, Gretchen. Gretchen.
Might as well just take off the gloves, let's
Yeah.
just get to it. So,
Yeah, and I have those. I printed them out, and I made some notes. And well, first off, I want to say this: as a coach, what I tend to do, people when I coach them, if someone were to come to me and ask me that question, I would take a moment and I would probably ask them a question in return, because I really believe that we do have answers within us, but we don't always. We just want the quick answer, but thinking through that yourself helps you come up with that answer, or obviously praying and asking the Lord. So what I put was, so let me just say this, that in my experience, I have a boy and a girl. It definitely was harder with the boy. My daughter tells me everything, and my son told me nothing. Now, we're fine, and we've worked that out over the years, but that's been my experience. It's not always that way, but I don't know how it was for you, Gretchen. I mean, it probably varied.
yeah, well, it's interesting as you say that. My daughters are soon to be 38, 34, and 29. And my sons are 35 and 35, 25, and soon to be 19.
Right.
And I still, to this day, have to weigh everything I say
Mm.
carefully with my daughters in a way that I don't have to weigh
Interesting.
when I say with my sons. Now, my eldest son cautioned me. He said, "Oh, no, no, don't think about that," because he said, "You say stuff, and I really perseverate on it for quite some time." But he said, "I'm much more likely to cut to the chase as far as how I feel about something
Right.
instead of tap dance around it," which I thought was really an interesting observation. And he didn't make that observation until 2 years ago.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, that's good. That's good. So I wrote a couple things down. So my first thing would be, what kinds of questions are you asking him? Are you asking him questions? And sometimes, you get the grunt, or you get a one-word answer. I mean, that's, boys can kind of be like that. So a couple of other things I would ask: is there I'm not sure how old, your teenage boy is. I don't know if he's 13 or 18, which, that all kind of plays into it and makes a difference. But, do you have any kind of, set time or intentional time where you guys can get together and you can take him to coffee, or you can go shoot hoops with him, or walk in the park, or go to his restaurant? I don't know what that looks like, but, doing that once a week or every other week, just to, sit and have time with him. And the other thing that, I would say is, uh, think about questions. Don't ask in the tip, how are you? What's going on? Find a book on questions, right? Find a book that offers, 1,000 questions to ask your kids or whatever. If you had all the money in the world, where would you travel to? Right? Or what nonprofit organization would you support if you had $500,000? Or like different kinds of questions, because otherwise you're just going to get same old, same old. So really thinking through what kinds of questions maybe that I need to steer away from, and what kinds of questions might be new and different to get him to think differently and respond. So it'll be some work, but I do
Right.
think it's possible.
Well, I think the other thing that goes hand in hand with that is if you have been a parent who has maybe not helped your children successfully define their own feelings. And that could be our parental backgrounds because my father said to me, feelings are irrelevant.
Mm.
And as someone who uh, lives by the seat of the pants of her feelings
Mm.
almost all the time, you can see where there would have been conflict
Yes,
there.
yes.
I think it's also important. Often when we ask boys to define their feelings, they don't have the nomenclature to do that.
Yeah, yeah,
We have
yeah.
to start defining for them. It
Yes,
looks to me like you might be frustrated in this situation. Is that what you're feeling? And
yes,
ask them to clarify for us.
yes. Very good.
Is that how you feel?
I love
We
that.
have it's not a question, but I love this statement from Luana. She says, the information you are sharing has answered questions that have bothered her since her mother started questioning her hands-off parenting style with young adults. And so I
Interesting.
think that that's really an interesting observation there. And she said, what could it mean when simple questions are answered defensively? And I know every parent who's listening to us knows exactly what that experience is because we've all had this experience. So what does that mean?
It's To me, it's Charlie Brown's teacher.
Yep.
Right? I mean, it's just wah, 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 like they're asking me again, how am I doing? And how are my grades? And what's going on? So it's just same old, same old. And change it up. Just change it up, because they're just, yeah, you're not going to get anything. Like you're doing the same thing, expecting different results,
Right.
which is insanity and doesn't work.
It's so funny. I remember this years and years ago, I made an observation about I had asked one of my boys how they felt about something, and he said, "Well, I don't know. I'll have to think about that."
Mhm.
And all of my daughters could wax eloquent
Yeah.
ad nauseum about how they felt about something. And so I thought, well, that's so weird. What do you mean? And my husband made this observation. He said, "Have you ever watched two boys hang out together? They both stand this way and they talk this way, and it's rare that they actually
Yes.
turn and face and look at each other.
Yes. Yes.
And girls
Yes.
tend to
It's funny.
engage more on a heart level, a social level, a personable level.
Absolutely.
So maybe as parents, it's up to us to help our kids figure out, so how do we identify our feelings? What are
Yes.
you feeling in this situation? Would it help? And maybe you get an answer of, nope, I don't want to talk about that.
Right, right. And well, what that just brought up to me also was the whole love language thing, right? Which again, there's tons of information out there on that. And, maybe their love language is not spending quality time. Maybe it's last on their list, right? And so they're like, but maybe it's a Starbucks gift card because gift giving is how they're loved. Or like my daughter, we say she needs her Hopi hugs, right? So like she loves touch. And so that's really important too, to knowing how, because I remember asking my kids when they were younger, and not so much now. I mean, I kind of know, but how do you best feel loved by mom? How do you
Mhm.
best feel loved by me? And I gave them the examples. And then they go, oh, I think it's this and this. And then, this is how I meet that need.
You know what surprised me more than anything else is I read that book, The Five Love Languages and the Five Love Languages for Kids. I read those back in the day, and I thought I had it nailed. until I went and started asking questions. And I
Mm.
think at that point, I only had 5 children, and I think I had 3 of them wrong.
Right. So you ask them.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, and if I could say this, Gretchen, that we tend to love with how we feel loved, right? So, like my husband, for instance, my husband, his love language is words of affirmation. That's last on my list. Okay. Spend time with me, and I know that you love me. It's last on his list. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
It's okay. We've been married 32 years. We still like each other. Okay. So anyway, but you have to work it out. And so he'd be loving me with, oh, you're the best, and saying all these things. I was like, yeah. I'm sorry, it just didn't do
It
anything, right?
right.
So it's so important to figure that out in the process, because then it's just you're on your way to a better connection.
But you know what? You said something really important here, and this is something we don't think about is what's last on your list? Because I'm like your husband. Words of affirmation are the thing that fills my tank.
Mm,
And my husband is like, that's last on his list. So
yeah.
it would be the last thing that would occur to him. And it used to really cause conflict for us because I would think, I've done all these things for you. Can't you at least say one kind thing? And
That sounds familiar.
And I think our audience members are probably seeing that as
Yes.
well. But um, I going back to Luana's question about when it's answered defensively, and you
Mm,
had said something in our conversation in preparation for this about knowing when the time is right to
mhm,
have those conversations.
mhm. Yeah. I mean, that's so important. Obviously, there's different kinds of conversations that you're going to have with your kids. And I'll just say for the important ones, because there's all different ones, I would say it's super important to be thinking about, okay, so, when should I have this conversation? And where should I have this conversation? And what kinds of questions should I ask? And um, one of the things I just mentioned this in, I think, one of my posts about, nonverbal cues are huge, Gretchen. And oh man, I got in trouble for facial expressions. My son would be like, "You're doing it again. You're doing it again." And I'd be like, change this. I don't even know how to change my facial expressions. So, all those things, those nonverbal cues, they speak louder than words sometimes. And so when you're in conversation with them, and you just need to be thinking about that, right? I mean, where, when, how much. Again, I go back to consistently, Gretchen, leaning on God to know really all of those things, because he knows your child better than you do. And so do I say, do I not say? And it's not, I mean, I'm not walking on, I don't feel like I'm, what's the word, walking on pins and needles or ice, or
Right.
what's the expression?
Eggshells, yes.
Eggshells, thank you. Eggshells. um but it's just wise, because you're wanting to maintain and you're wanting to encourage. And again, it's a new place. You're going into a new place in your relationship. They're not 13 anymore.
Right. I had the most interesting conversation with my 18-year-old a couple of weeks ago. He bought for Christmas for himself a deck of cards that is
Mhm,
a game
mhm,
that you sit down and each of you plays a card, and the card asks the other player a question. And the only rules to the game are that you have to be willing to answer the question honestly.
mhm.
It's a fascinating conversation between the two of us when we
Love
played.
that.
And I said, one of the things that I learned is I used to irritate the absolute stuffing out of him because when I could see that he was troubled, I
Mm,
wanted to help. And
yes.
so I kept coming after him. And he said, if I had learned, if I had learned to um, say, hey, it looks to me like you're troubled. And when you're ready, I'm here to talk. and then just walked away. And
Yes.
he said, and I said, "Oh my
So good.
gosh, I am so sorry." He goes, "No, no, you finally figured it out." But he said, "It really took you some time and it used to really irritate me." And I'm sitting there thinking, "Oh my gosh, I never even realized he was irritated."
Wow.
And so, and
Wow.
so that was really an interesting, it was a super interesting conversation. Um, I'll put the game in the show notes because I
Please.
think a lot of moms of teenagers
Yes.
would find it to be tremendously beneficial. So
Love it.
maybe the front way to load that, how do how do you get them to talk about their true feelings, is you don't come at it directly. Maybe you come at it
Yeah, and I mean, it depends on the person, right? Like my daughter would go,
right.
right? She would just tell me how she felt from A to Z. And, my
And
son
my
might be,
husband, if Gabriel and his Trump showed up and said, "Tell me how you really feel about this, and you'll be in," my husband wouldn't be in because most of the time he doesn't know how to
yeah,
quantify
yeah,
how
yeah,
he really feels about something,
yeah, yeah,
which I think is really interesting.
yeah.
So there was a tangential question to what we've talked about. When is the best time to have these kinds of conversations? And I think I know what you're going to answer here, but
Not during, arguments or emotional upheavals. Um, really, always, I think I wrote in the book too about you have permission to step away. You have permission to step away from a situation because I can tell you that with the brain, right? So when we are in it and it's not really going anywhere, you are in the back part of your brain. And what happens is you don't have any access to the front part of your brain where you make executive decisions and decision making and judgment and things like that. That is shut down because you're just fighting right now, fighting, or you're running, or you're freezing up, and that's a real thing in your life. And so it's really best to step away and reconvene. So the best time to have those important conversations, or I would say to plan them, like, hey, let's get together. We did this with our kids. Let's go have coffee next week, or let me take you out to eat, or let's go take a walk in the park or ride our bikes or whatever. So
sure.
environment, I like to talk about environment, Gretchen. Super important, picking, like, priming the environment. It helps.
So are you saying that there would be an advantage to maybe a coffee shop would be more neutral territory?
Well, I would say that too, but if it's their favorite place, they're going to be more. You're trying to open up the brain, right? You're trying to open up the brain for trust. It's their favorite coffee shop. You bought them their favorite drink. You planned it. They need planning. Like my husband is a planner, where I'm like, let's go. I want to go. Da da da. And he's like, oh no, no, that's too much. I need a week to plan that. So I don't know how your child is, right? They might be spontaneous. They might need a couple days. So there's just some things that you can do to prep that. And you also might want to say, hey, I really want to talk to you about X, Y, and Z, just to kind of give you a heads up, so that maybe they will take some time. And if you have some solutions, or I want to hear what you feel, I want to hear what you think. You might not use the word feel if they're not there, but I want to know what you think about this, because I love John Maxwell. I don't know if you know John Maxwell. He's like a leadership expert, and he says that being heard is like being loved.
I think that's really true. And there's another mom asked us this question, which is how do you navigate these later stages when they need more autonomy, but you're still responsible for their well-being?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I know that you have opinions about that. I have some opinions as well. So I'd love to hear what your observations are there.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the agreements. I think it goes back to making an agreement, which we had to do when my daughter came home. She's been in New York City since she was 18. She's 24 now. And when COVID hit, obviously we didn't know what was going on in the world. And so we brought her home for 4 months. And then after 4 months, she was done and she was like, oh, I got to go back. And so obviously we were terrified for a lot of reasons. And but we came to the table and made the agreement of what that would look like. And we still did contribute to her financially a little bit, not a lot. She was pretty much taking care of herself, but it was just a respectful thing, to do, like, we could be like, you're not going back there. No way. It's crazy. Right. But no, we felt like, okay, but we needed to make an agreement, and we all did and contributed to it. And that's how we moved.
Now, you said something earlier in our conversation that I think is really interesting, and I maybe want to visit it a little bit again. And that was talking about failure,
Mm,
and that our children need to know that it's safe to fail within our presence
mm,
so that they can understand. I think someone, I don't know who it was. I think I read this in Gretchen Rubin's book, but I might be making a misattribution, so don't go chase down Gretchen Rubin's book. But failure is a first attempt in learning. And
mhm.
if we hold these things, our successes and our failures loosely, maybe it's easier for us. But how do you reach a child when they've done something that has been a failure, and you want to have that conversation with them,
Mhm,
but you're not sure how that's going to be received? And you've given us some good advice. Set it up in advance. Say you
mhm,
want to talk about this. But
mhm,
how do you, I guess what I'm really looking for in the answer to this question is, how do you reach them when you know their heart's sore?
obviously gently and graciously. And I like to say we either win or we learn, right? You mentioned learning, right? So we either win and learn in our journey in life. And even as parents, we have our moments. And I talk a lot about modeling. I think that we get to model. I had a situation probably in the last couple of months. I was asked to speak somewhere, and I just felt like I bombed. I felt like I didn't do well. I left there. I was like, that was terrible. And I called my daughter to talk to her about it. And she was like, just encouraging me, and because this is what we've done, encourage each other. But I think that, again, it's gently, graciously, and the question would be, um, okay, so, you know, have your day, go eat chocolate, do whatever. But tomorrow, let's begin again. And, his mercies are new every morning. And so, what did we learn from that? What did we learn that we don't want to do next time, or that we do want to do next time? So we need to extrapolate, right? Everything in that situation that's possible. And they might not want to do that right away because it's painful, depending upon what it is. But there's always something to be learned in, I don't say failure, because it's really an opportunity to learn. If we are not failing forward, we are not getting out of our comfort zone, and we are not learning.
How do you deal with a teenager who makes poor decisions and disregards advice, or who disrespects the advice you provide? These were two questions that parents ask us. And I think, man, these are so deep. And
They are
they,
deep. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Gretchen.
nope, go on.
Um,
These aren't softball questions that I'm lobbing at you either.
I
So
know that. And so, yeah, again, I would answer that if someone were to ask me that in a coaching session. I would ask them certain questions back, because that is really there's so much, like, how old is he? How long has he been disrespectful? How involved is your husband? What have you done in the past? I mean, there's so much, like, I don't think it's right to give advice on something like that, because there's this whole part of the story that
that we don't
I
know. Yes.
know nothing about. And I can just tell you this, that my son came out of the womb wanting to rule the world. And so God said, turn around while I put this rod in your back. So, it was me against him for many years. Uh, but, I can tell you that we had that. I mean, he would disrespect me. He would, again, again, again. And my husband would get up in his business all the time. You will respect your mother. You will respect your mother. And so, and there were consequences, that happened, which
Mhm.
are an absolute. But I can tell you, when I read that question, what I thought was, when they get to a certain point, our job becomes, I think, calling them to the standard, calling them to the standard, calling them to the standard. Whether they do it or not, that is not your deal. It is our job. We have been commissioned to call them to this higher place of living. They might hit it 1% or 10%, I don't know. But keep calling them, because that is your job. And I can tell you now, my 29-year-old son is amazing, respectful. I have watched him. I mean, he respects me. He respects other people. I watch him engage with people who are like, oh my gosh, he's amazing, blah, blah, blah. All that to say, just keep calling them to that place, even though it's hard. So
Yes.
important.
Right. And I was making some notes from a YouTube video that I was watching earlier this week, and I am reminded of this. The presenter said this thing. He said, have something to learn, not something to prove, which I think is huge. And I'm like, there might have been times when I parented from the position of, I'm going to prove it to you. But the other thing that he said is, what triggers you teaches you. So
Yeah.
if you feel like you're being disrespected, and believe me, thou I singest to the choir here to
Yeah.
myself. If I feel like there has been a disrespectful statement there, perhaps what I need to do is pause and observe and see, well, what really happened here?
Mhm.
Was he really disrespectful, or was I just tromping over every boundary he had set as the
Mhm.
parent and saying, thou shalt do this because you are my child?
Well, and again, that's not going to fly at 17, 18, 19. I mean, it's just not. And especially for men, their big need is respect.
Yes. And one of the things, Patty, that came through in a lot of these questions was this thing.
Yeah.
How do we help our kids learn to navigate this safely,
Yeah, that's
gently?
when you find the answer, let me know. Yeah, I mean,
Now,
the
I
only thing,
should say, for those who are listening to the audio of this recording, I just held up my phone and pointed
yes,
at it because,
yes,
these things are ubiquitous in our lives. So we've got to negotiate a truce with them
yes,
so that they don't rule our lives.
that's right.
And
And
that's
they're not
hard.
going away. They're not going
Right.
away. And there's so many studies that have come out about, well, about social media, right? Because they all get on their phones. And, the first thing I would say, hold out as long as you can. There's these phones now that don't have the social media. It's just like calling or texting. I think it's called Gab. There's probably different ones. Totally would be all on board with that. I'm glad I didn't have to deal with that with my children. I always come back to, who owns the phone? I
Right.
mean, who owns the phone? It's not theirs. It's a privilege. It's not an entitlement. And there's definitely agreements that can be set around that phone. I mean,
It's so interesting that you would say that, because this time last year I was having a little bit of back and forth with my then senior in high school about his phone. And interestingly enough, his 25-year-old brother is a cybersecurity analyst, and he does no social media at
mm,
all. He said, because I know how much data they collect, and he said, I don't want it. So he will watch YouTube videos on his computer, but on his phone, you won't find an app on his phone, which I think is really interesting, because fast forward a year, here I was griping at my senior in high school, you're really on your phone an awful lot. And he's now almost 19, and he's in his room. He's an electrician's apprentice. And I hear this alarm go off at like 8:45 last night. And like, what is that? Why do you have an alarm going off at 8:45? And he laughed and he said, I set an alarm for myself that I can spend an hour on my phone in the evening. And when the alarm goes off, I'm done.
it's great. Love
I
it.
did not teach him that. I did not
Right.
set that boundary for him. In fact, I don't have that boundary for myself.
Yeah.
But, I'm really proud of him, because he said, back to that card game that we played, he said, one of the questions was asked, what is something that your what is something a parent told you that it turned out to be true?
Mm,
And he
it's good.
said, the amount of time I wasted on my phone.
Yeah, it's good.
Now, if you had told me a year ago when we were hammer and tongs about this, that we would have this conversation 2 weeks ago, I wouldn't have believed you.
Right, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I
It's a
think it makes a
challenge.
difference.
It's a challenge for sure.
Another question, Patty, that we had, and oh, I can't believe we're coming up to the top of the hour here, but how much should a parent guide a student through their post high school plans and decisions? And boy, I tell you what, I get this question from parents all the time when I speak at conferences. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about that, because each of your children chose the paths that there were their heart's desire. But I know you said that in in their path choosing, there was a little anxiety there. So can
Yeah.
we talk about that?
Yeah, yeah. So with my son, um, he went back to school for high school and went to private school and graduated, went to University of Arkansas, and that was kind of the natural progression. And for him, he has never really been a student. Honestly, he just obviously did what he did. I mean, he's fine, but had some entrepreneurial blood in him, and so he eventually. He actually worked at a restaurant for a while. He was a bartender. That was really wonderful. I was so proud of that. But let's be honest here. They're going to do things that I was like, a bartender. He's out of that. And he's a real estate agent now and doing extremely well. But I always knew it. Like, I knew this, like, he's going to own like Dallas Fort Worth one day just because it's kind of in his blood. So, obviously, the college thing, he was open to that. He wanted to, take that path, and we certainly welcome that. But then we got to the point where he was like, you know what? I don't know. I really don't think this is for me. I'm gonna take some time off, and I want to go to Colorado for 6 months and work the ski lifts. Okay. So that was fun, and he did that, and then he came back and again worked at the restaurant, and then eventually went back and took his real estate license. But all along the way, we were talking with him, and he was, we said, well, we don't really think that's a good idea, but if that's your choice, he wasn't living at home, so it wasn't like, and you kind of lose control after a while. And so again, but he was still asking us and talking to us, which again was built before that, right? In building that bond and building the trust and listening well, and not like, what do you do? No,
Right.
that doesn't work. So anyway, and then with my daughter, she had no desire to go to college. She's an actress and she wanted to go to an acting conservatory in New York. She had learned under a certain type of technique. And we just kind of prayed through all of that and felt like that was it. Yeah, that's what you should do. And so that's what she did. And, you know, so she's a waitress and figuring out being an actress. And so obviously you think to yourself, and we did have a conversation. She came home for Christmas. I was like, what are you thinking? You're going to be 25 this year. And so, and she's like, believe me, mom, I'm very aware of, time kind of, marching on. And so, you just have to kind of
Right.
know what to say and what to say.
Those conversations, Patty, didn't start for you when they were seniors in high school either. They
Right.
started far sooner than that. And if I could say something that would encourage the parents who are joining us today and listening to this later, start those conversations with your kids when they're 10, 11, 12,
Yes.
13. Because believe me, hold all of those things very loosely because their plans are going to change
Yes.
multiple times. But
Yes.
if you have created that atmosphere where they can say, I was thinking I want to go spend 6 months working the ski lifts in Colorado, then it's not a scary proposition to be able to float that to you as a parent.
So good. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think it makes so much difference. I cannot believe we are at the top of the hour and we didn't get to even a portion of these wonderful questions that we were asked. So perhaps, Patty, we'll have to revisit this maybe
Sure.
sometime later this year. But what would be your closing words of wisdom for our families today who have joined us?
I think it would be, I think when I think my son was maybe 15 or so, I remember resolving in my heart that I wasn't going to camp on this is the way that he needs to go, right? Like, this is what he needs. I mean, you mentioned about your father, right? Because who am I? I mean, I have dreams for my children, absolutely, but are they their dreams?
Right.
So really holding loosely and praying through it and asking God to lead them and guide them and to lead and guide me so that we can, ultimately have a close family and relationship. Because I mean, I think as moms, ultimately that's what we want. I mean, we've poured our heart and our soul into our children. And, there's a lot out there today where there's this, no contact parent thing going on, or they don't have the close relationship that they want, but it's really in your court, and it comes down to what adjustments do you need to make so that you can continue to have that lifelong relationship with them.
Right. You said something early on in the conversation that I think is also a key takeaway for parents to have, and that is that vulnerability
Mhm.
to keep your accounts short
Mhm.
and be able to say,
Yes,
I blew this one. So
yes,
can we revisit this conversation? Can we try again? Because as parents, our children are given to us for such a brief period of
yes,
time. And
yes,
it makes such a difference. And
yes,
I have so thoroughly enjoyed. Now, Patty, before we conclude,
yes.
tell us the name of your book again and the
Okay.
website where parents can
I
find
don't
more
know if this is
information.
backwards, but it's face to face, smart conversations with yourself, your teenager, and your young adult.
Wonderful.
And my website is Patti Reed, PattiReed.net.
Okay.
And I also have a resource. It's called 10 Tried and Tested Wise Insights for moms, really to help you through different situations. So I that on my website. You can just scroll down some and you'll see you can click on it, and you can get on my email list. I do send out weekly emails to encourage and equip. And so would love to have you.
Absolutely. And of course, all that information will be included in the show notes because I think you'll find Patty a tremendously valuable resource. I know that I have enjoyed knowing her these last 6 months, and I've been so excited to have the opportunity to share this hour with her today. So,
Thank you so much, Gretchen. It was great.
oh, it has been a great pleasure to have you here. This is Gretchen Rowe for the Demme Learning Show. Thank you all so much for joining us. You can access the show notes and watch a recording at demmelearning.com/show or on our YouTube channel. And be sure to rate, review, follow, or subscribe wherever you may be hearing this, especially if you really enjoyed it. Take care, everyone. We'll look forward to your joining us again soon. Bye-bye.